Hello and welcome to The Magic in You, where I am here with Craig Spencer, who is a witch, author, and teacher from the Greater Manchester area of England. He also holds a Bachelor of Science degree with honours from the University of Salford and a Postgraduate Certificate in Education from the University of Central Lancaster. And in his downtime, Craig enjoys reading, learning new languages, and has a passion for all things, both comedy and horror. And I said Craig is the author. I've got the two of his books here, his date on Aradia and also Witchcraft Unchained, which hopefully we'll get a chance to chat about in a moment. But first, I just want to bring Craig onto the screen and welcome you in, Craig. Thank you for talking about the magic in you.
Thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to the chat.
It's fantastic. So why don't we dive in? I've been wanting to talk to you because you are actually one of these people who are born into a family of witches and grew up all around the occult from a very early age. So from someone who found the craft later in their life, I guess one of the first questions that comes to mind is what was that like, especially when you see, say, the magic and that of the craft being normal as part of your everyday life, and how do you sort of react today? Come across like people like myself who have to go through training and don't really understand what it was like for you to see your normal as opposed to my normal upbringing.
Yeah, well, this was something that I didn't realize was not normal until I really got online, because I kind of took it for granted, which I think you would if it's something that's been around you since a child. You take pretty much everything you grow up with for granted to an extent because it's your normal. And I mean, I knew by the time I was in high school that there was. I became more aware there was something a bit more unusual there because the school I went to when I was in primary school, so that's the ages of approximately 5 till about 11. Um, it was like a small local town school, and people knew my family, so it wasn't a weird thing. Like I went to a Church of England school, so it was a church school, but the people there knew anyway, so it kind of wasn't a weird thing. It was only when you get high school where you have other kids from other areas come in, it was like, oh, this is a bit weird. Am I weird? It was kind of one of those things. But it wasn't ever anything that was pointed out to me as strange before that. I think the only things that I can reflect back on were I was one of the more vocal kids in the class. I was happy to stand there and speak, and there was the school nativity. It wasn't a nativity play. It was just like a reading out, and because I was one of the louder kids, they asked if it would be okay if I read a part because they wanted me to read a big part. It was a big chunk because they knew I would remember it. I would learn my lines. So that was a conversation, and my mum pretty much just said, "Well, if he wants to do it, then yeah, that's fine." So she said, "Oh, do you want to go to the church and read this thing out? The teachers want you to do it." And I just said, "Yeah, sure." Um, I've said before, which always makes people laugh. I always thought that churches were a school thing because they were always associated with schools around the area, and when we would go to them, they were always isolated because we were young, just to our class. And because it wasn't something that I went to like for mass on Sunday or anything like that, I saw it as a school thing. They were part of school projects. The vicar would come in and do assembly on Friday. And that's pretty much where I thought it was. And it was only as I got older in primary school that they started mixing us in with adults. And I was like, wait, what's going on? Whose parents are these? And it became that thing. So the occult was quite normal for me in that respect. I went to occult shops probably from the age of 8. I think 8 was the earliest I went, but I do remember sitting in the back room at 8 talking about conjuration of spirits and demons and the Goetia and alchemy and all sorts. Why I'm there with my like pop, sat on this sofa in the back, and it was quite ordinary. I mean, I was supervised. It was always said to me in a age appropriate way. It was always don't do these things. These are things you might want to look into when you're older. But it was always kept as a age appropriate conversation. So yeah, it was very normal for me until I hit high school, and it was also the time when the chat rooms were much bigger on occult spaces. You could see things, and you kind of learned more about people. I remember the libraries with pictures of Alexander's and Maxine and Gerald Gardner in my high school library. So I would bring all the witchcraft books home because it was just things I didn't have access to. And then reading those things, and it was like, oh, these people's backstories are very different. And so I think that's when I became more aware that maybe it was a little less traditional than I thought.
Oh, thank you for sharing. And you did mention that when you started getting more sort of worldly when it comes to other witchcraft traditions or other witches out there, in particular in England, sort of the bigger names that we, on shall we say, the outside world are more familiar with, Gardner and Alexander's and Maxine Sanders and the like. How did that sort of react? Because I'm gathering that your own family tradition of witchcraft, that would make you technically a hereditary witch. Was it, and I do recall reading somewhere, I think around Gardner, that in one of his writings or someone's writings about him, they talked about 9 covens originally, and that were around at the same time when he sort of recreated, became very vocal of the revival of witchcraft, his tradition of witchcraft. Is your family line, where does your family lineage come in? Or is it just very related to that part of Lancashire where it came from? Or is it wider, like through your parents' line going back to, I don't know, when you talk about Aradia too, I know you have a Italian background, part of your lineage. Is it connected in with that? So we used to
So
set in.
yeah, so there's some folk customs through the Italian side, but I wouldn't say it was what I would describe as witchcraft. There are witchcraft elements, I would say, that, but I would see them more as culture. Um, the traditions that are passed in through my family are more through my mum's line, which is all the Lancashire area. It is more to do with where I live. It's regional. You know, there's certain customs and traditions that we would see as being very witchy that I remember being talked about on the playground by a few kids. So it was one of those things. I mean, I jokingly said, but it's half true in a sense that my first coven was when I was in primary school. We had when it was broken into infants and juniors, and when we were the juniors, there was this huge um, grassy area. I can't really think what it I can't think how you would call it. This is like a field. It was so big. It had a rugby style pitch on it, and then you still had room to send all the kids around playing without interfering with that. And so some of the kids would play sports there, and you would break off into groups. And they would always do this in the summer when they got the guys on with the ride on lawnmowers to cut all the grass, and they'd leave all the loose grass behind. And what some of my friends and me did was we would pick up these big wads of grass, and we formed this really tight circle in just this little area near the trees. And we would gather in it, we would chant, we would dance, we would do the little bits that we knew for group work, and we would just try and do some magic set, just experience, and then we'd go off. But we took it very seriously. But I mean, looking at it now, it was very childish, but it was also we were kids, so it was going to be childish. But in a other way, we took it very seriously. We really was trying to do something, even though if we had any magical goals, I don't remember what any of them were. It was probably like, let's hope we don't get any homework, But yeah, that was something that we did quite regularly in the summer when we were allowed on that field because we were allowed near these trees. And I remember it was really weird because there were these. We don't know actually if they were, but they almost looked like tombstones that were sort of lopsided. So if they were tombstones, they didn't have the writing up. So that's how we were sure. But they were by the base of these trees, and the field area had been lots of other things previously before it was part of school grounds. So we didn't know what it was, but we just saw it as very spooky, very odd. And we thought, what a great place. It's quite quiet. No one comes over here. Let's form our little circle. And this circle pretty much stayed intact. We could go home, come back, and just have to move a few little piles of grass back into place. And yeah, so I always jokingly say that was my first coven. But the home part of it, I don't know where my family part really, how far back that goes, and whether they would have called themselves witches, whether they would have called it something slightly different. But I do know that my family were involved with a lady who's known locally, and she died in, oh, let me get this right. So she died in 1860 something. She was 20 years before Gardner was born. He was 1880, and then whatever the number is. And she was literally the same thing, just 20 years prior. And they were involved in her group. Now, she's never described in any writings as being a witch. They always say she wasn't a witch, but then they always say she was the leader of a local coven. She made potions, she made spells, she would make love potions, so it was, she's a witch, but also we had this thing in my area. I remember this. And my family would always say to me, no, we don't say witch. We could say in the house, not out of the house, because it's just not a local done thing. And this is where I find going online, and when I became, as you said, more worldly, this is one of the things I find peculiar, because Wicca is our local dialect word for witch. But that was the acceptable thing to say outside. So you said that you was a Wicca, not a witch. But I find that so confusing, because I was like, well, it's witchcraft. We are witches. Why don't we say witch? So I was always, that was the one naughty thing I always did. I always said witch outside the house. And it was like, we don't say that word.
You raised a really interesting point, because you mentioned it in Witchcraft Unchained, and you also on your Instagram page have pinned this sort of excerpt from, I'm assuming, a pamphlet or an older book about the word Wicca. And these days, everybody's running around calling themselves a witch, and there's a backlash towards Wicca, in particular Gardnerian or Alexandrian Wicca. But you looking at the original sort of the etymology of the word, and I find that really interesting, because Wicca itself is a word that's evolved over time, and you give a little bit more of an insight as to the different spellings, the double C, the single C that Gardner had. And can you just elaborate a little bit more of that for people who haven't
Sure.
seen this post? Because very, very insightful.
Yeah, so the post was from, it's a storybook, but it's written in my area's dialect. So people will say Old English is technically a dead language, which is true, because it means it's not spoken widely, but it's survived in our dialect. I mean, we even have Old Norse hangovers from when we were invaded by the Vikings. So it was, we still say a lot of words. We have little bits of French peppered into our dialect. So if something was ever spoken here, we still speak it pretty much. But the Anglo-Saxon is still very much the strongest part of our dialect. And the word Wicca with the two C's has a couple of meanings. It means witch, but then it also means rowan tree. But that's because locally we call rowan trees witch trees. So if you then, as my granddad would have said, talk broad when you're speaking in a thicker dialect accent, we would say Wicker Road, which just means witch tree. And then you would say Wiccan as a plural. So if there was quite a few rowan trees, then there'd be Wiccan. And then with the single C, it's a word that's become a synonym for witch in a sense, primarily through Gerald Gardner, but in our dialect, it's a reference to witch hazel, and the witch in that means bend, twist. Although it was very popular, particularly in a lot of the books in the 80s and the 90s, to talk about witches bending and twisting reality with their magic. So I can see why people jumped onto the witch in Witch Hazel and the twist and took meaning from that. And I don't think there's a problem with that, actually. But the one that I grew up with was the 2C spelling. So when I saw people using it as the name of a religion versus as a name for themselves, that was the thing that first made me think, oh, there's something that other people are doing who are witches legitimately, but it's a bit different, and I think that's the other thing when you stay young, I think you take certain things for granted, that you just assume witches are all the same everywhere, and then you see there's actually a lot of difference and a lot of traditions and a lot of ways of doing things, and um, variety is the spice of life, as they say. So, I hold no opinion on that. I just know that it was different to what I knew. But then there was also a lot of similarities, like casting circles. Everyone will say that's a Gardnerian thing. But then I'm like, well, there was a guy who lived, let me think what direction. I'm going to go about there. If we could go in a straight line, it would be about 10 minutes. And he was the only person in my town who was ever executed for witchcraft. And he died in the 1500s, and his crime was forming a magic circle and calling spirits to stand at the cardinal directions. So it was like, it's obviously predates Gardner by quite a bit. So it's definitely something that I'm familiar with, and I think is one of those things that I think's quite a very unique element of witchcraft. Yes, ceremonial magicians do it, but they do it for a different reason. So yeah, I always like the differences, but I always like the similarities a bit more.
And I think these days too, and we can see it in, especially with social media and the internet really taking off. It's almost like a narrowing down of definitions and interpretations as to how things should be done. And then someone like yourself who is outside of that, excuse me, description, and it's just like, well, you don't sort of fit in, or so you're looking at your own, or what you think is your own tradition, your own family line from an outsider's point of view, and saying it doesn't quite fit in. Because I also have a friend who's now passed who comes from a family line of Druids, and that's what they called themselves. Yet what we see as being practiced as Druidry these days, which is the sort of the Reconstructionists, especially the Obod Druid, is not anything near what his and his family line used to practice. So there are a lot of differences out there. And from someone who's sort of come in, say, through I wouldn't say indoctrinated, it's a little bit harsh, but the sort of the more modern concepts, it can be a bit, I'd say, depending on how open you are, but can be a bit confronting to realize that there are other forms of, say, in this case, witchcraft that actually don't fit into the labels, little boxes that we have these days. And no doubt you've come across that with people sort of looking at, when you talk about, what your family does and saying, well, yeah, you can't be a witch because you don't fit these ticks in these boxes as well.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, like, there's people who would argue, like, oh, well, you've never been initiated this way or that way, or, somebody wasn't holding up their pinky on a Friday why they declared you a witch. It was like, um, but I mean, realistically, these things came after there were already people practicing. I mean, it's also quite well documented in my county, at least, as far back as it was, I think, 1740 something. There's actually a letter to one of our MPs in Parliament where a group of people wrote, signed by one person under a pen name, that they wanted the Witchcraft Act repealing because they said it was so open in our area that we were referred to across the country as the county of witches, and even the local MP, there was speculation that he owed his recent promotion in Parliament to the intervention of a familiar spirit. It says, so we don't see why the act should be on the books because we're pretty much, and this is again why the Wicca thing, because you just have regions where people were just using slang words for witch because at the time you just weren't allowed to say the word witch. That was how the Witchcraft Act was sat on the books at that time. You just couldn't say you was a witch. So people just got around it by doing witchy things and just using a different word, and said, "Well, I'm not calling myself a witch." And I think that's also why it was a big thing for me growing up, because I had not just my grandparents, I had my great grandparents alive, and they lived both sides of the Witchcraft Act being on the books and repealed. So I think for them, it was more a thing like my grandma, who's actually my great grandma, but I always called her grandma. She and at the time her husband was still alive. They moved house, and they had this big trunk, and they had things stolen out of it. But the biggest things that were stolen, they had two copper cauldrons in there, and they didn't report it to the police because then they would have to describe what's the value of these cauldrons, what's the association with these cauldrons, and they just knew it wasn't worth bringing law in, so they just had to let themselves effectively be robbed of something that was probably going to be melted down as scrap, um, because because they couldn't get the law involved at that time, because the law was still on the books. So they couldn't describe it and then be accused of being a witch and have that label slapped on them and halted off. So I remember the trunk, but I never saw in it. Actually, that's one of my biggest regrets. If I could ever get in a TARDIS and go back to my grandma's, it would be to open the trunk. That it was kept in this room that I always found very. I always loved odd and macabre things, even from being a child. It was just something that spoke to my soul. But there was something eerie about that room that I never wanted to poke around in it too much. I poked around everywhere else. It was just this one room I would, and the trunk was just by the door. It was there. It was almost teasing me, like, "Come and open me. I'm not locked." But I never went in it, and I don't know what was in the end. What was in there? I have things of hers, but were they in the box? Were they somewhere else in the room? I don't know. So I don't know what the significance. I will actually show it. I've never shown this. I don't ever, but
Oh,
this coal horse was hers, and you can probably see on the camera. I don't know if you can very well
right.
here. It's really shiny. A lot of my family were coal miners, so the coal miners were said to be lucky because they got the coal stuck to them, and people would always want to shake their hands when they were coming out the pits because they were covered in coal. But if you was a miner, it was said that in your family, the coal or the spirit of the coal was very lucky for your family. And this horse, it's had its nose rubbed a lot in times of need, crisis. So it's really buffed, but it always comes through for our family. And after my grandma died, it should have gone to my nan, but she let it pass to me. So it just sits here in my room, and I've rubbed its nose at different times. My grandma's ring, her wedding band, that one's popped out of its box and just been sat on top of the box in a drawer at my nan's in times of need. When I was going for my driving test, it was just sat on top of the jewelry box, not in the jewelry box. So she said, "Right, I think Grandma wants to be with you." So it went in my pocket when I took my test. So I felt very calm. Felt like I had that nice presence there. So I mean, there's weird things like that. People might not call that witchcraft; they might call it superstition. I might agree with them on that, but I definitely say it's spooky. Grandma was a witch, so I wouldn't be surprised if she's taking that wedding ring out and saying, "Take me with you," Um, but yeah, the horse is one of my favourite things of hers. But I didn't see much of it when she was alive. I did see but it moved about. I used to see it when it was in the living room. But yeah, that's one of my things. I always wonder what was in her box. My mum never doesn't know either. I'd probably have to ask my nan and see if she remembers. She doesn't remember everything that was in there, but she does know the
Mm.
cauldrons were in there until they were swiped.
Well, that's unfortunate about the culture because I'm quite sure, especially back in that day, they would have been by hand beaten and there would have been so much sort of, yeah, history and magic, still all the residue of it so attached to it. But you have sort of like raised, at least in my mind, sort of a really interesting point or something that I think that we need to keep in mind, especially in our modern age, is that and England is one of these places where every little county, whatever areas in the counties have this long and very deep, rich history. And especially in the area where you live in Lancashire, I've been there many, many years ago, because of the nature of it. And then we're going back in history, people didn't travel very far, very isolated. I know, and we're talking off camera. I spent some time in a tiny little town called Bacup, just outside Manchester, and that they could smell you if you hadn't lived in that area. And it's sort of like there was a program many years ago about I think a village on the Pennines or on the areas there that if you weren't local, people wouldn't talk to you or wouldn't talk openly around you about family or local matters. And when they meant local, you meant like a couple of generations to having lived in that area. So you have that sort of build up of families knowing each other. And as you said, when you grew up, you had that sort of almost a personal egregore, a little village egregore of that which contained all the history. And when we remember that witchcraft itself originated in England, in Britain, you've got that right back before the word witch that we relate to emerged into language, really. So you're tapping back into all of that, which I find really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we were laughing at the other day. I was
Mm.
talking about the whole if you're a local thing to somebody the other day, and I was saying it's kind of funny because if you get on a buzz, if you've got the right accent and people sit next to you, you don't just end up with the life story, you end up with all the family secrets too at the end of the buzz ride because people are happy to just talk and share everything. But if somebody, like you said, if someone's out of the area, they might not be as forthcoming, you know. But these people talk to you like they've known you forever. And I always say it's weird. I remember when I went to York, which is only going east, and it was a completely different culture. I was still expecting, well, we're northern, we're going to have similarities, which we did, but even just ordering food was weird just because the names of things were different and it was like I was in a foreign country trying to speak the local like language and I was speaking just like English really slowly to somebody who doesn't speak English. And I was like, come on, you must know this. We're Northern. And we were trying to decipher what the order was until we got there. And when they finally figured it out and then they said what it was, and we was like, yeah, yeah. And then when they left the table, we all just looked around the table like, they call it what? you know? So, yeah, our counties are really small, but I think as well that tracks back to um, really a tribal background. You know, people forget that we were broke up in tribes at one time, and we still even, although the jokes today, a lot of the jokes about places that feud are references to tribal feuds, but we still make those jokes today, but they're just jokes that are made at football instead of actually going to war with the local tribe. So it is kind of weird that certain things have really clung on. And I think, like you said as well, because people didn't travel, that insular thing meant that stories were kept, culture was kept. It wasn't blending with anything else, so it wasn't. I don't want to say watered down, but it was. In a way, it was more concentrated because it was all people who knew the same story, sharing the same story, sharing the same culture, food, language, and you didn't have people traveling to move in different live in different parts of the country like you do now, or taking work very far. Like my great grandparents, who I was on about before, my granddad on that side, he had a horse and cart. You know, at one point he didn't have a car; it was a horse and cart. So it's like realistically, you know, he wasn't going far in that. You know, he wasn't
Mm.
going down the motorway. You know, where that's how he got to work. He went round. He was like he had a time where after he was in the mines, he was like I don't know what you call it, like fruit and veg kind of seller, So he like the market kind of thing. So that's what he did. He just did a horse and cart,
Mm.
and um, so yeah, people weren't traveling very far. I mean, the furthest he probably went from his house at that time was probably like 15 minutes away.
Mm.
So yeah, I think really my generation are probably the ones who've travelled the furthest because I
Mm.
live in a semi-rural town as well. So it's like I went to university, so I went and travelled to university. Where a lot of people stayed at home or they worked and then came home. Where when you're commuting, even just to study, it was quite different.
Mm.
So
Mm.
yeah, that's quite an interesting point. I wouldn't have thought of that if you hadn't have mentioned it, but yeah, it's very true.
Mm. Yeah, I sort of think about it too because I grew up in New Zealand and where on my mother's line where they lived, and I'm thinking about my grandmother, and I mean, I wouldn't call her a witch. She was very superstitious, but then that generation she was, well, they all were. But where she lived, where they grew up, it was very rugged, very, what's that, isolated. I mean, there's roads and things now. But again, they had horses. They were farmers, and it was like a one day horse ride or half a day horse ride, even to get to the nearest town, or if you cut yourself in the fields, whatever. So you learnt how to use your local herbs to make poultices and pack wounds, and that was just part of life. That wasn't, today they're witches. Like, well, no, you didn't have, a medical cupboard where you can reach for the aspirin or the bandages and things like that. But she did. I remember new moons. We turned 5-cent pieces over. I don't know why it was a silver 5-cent piece. Always curtsied at the new moons. She would get mushrooms in her garden. I remember being told off for breaking mushroom rings. But yeah, we wouldn't call her a witch, but there's that sort of like folk tradition, superstition that comes through, say, the British line that we're sort of connected in as well, which is just part of, I suppose, the history of growing up in Britain. But you've had that it's concentrated where you live and also all through your life, which is coming out in Witchcraft Unchained, because you do sort of touch on some things a lot of things actually that aren't in every other book that people write, including my own book on witchcraft. Some really interesting things that sort of bring people back to the Britishness, shall we say, or even the Lancashire sort of essence, the originality and the mindset of how witchcraft sort of evolved before Llewellyn, before mass production of the books out there. So what was the inspiration for what writing Witchcraft Unchained? Because there's so many. I mean, it's not a beginner's book, but it's a history book, but there's more to it than that as well. Because you also mentioned a bit of the Kabbalah in there, so there's a whole area. It's really fascinating. So what was your inspiration?
Right, so I'm going to be very honest on this now. Right, so my inspiration started through eye rolls. I saw certain things and I'd go, and it was to the point where if the wind changed, I'd have been cross-eyed. At that point, I was rolling it that frequently, and I was having all these discussions with the people around me, mainly my family. And one of the things that I said is, I don't get why people make it so complicated. They make the simple things really complicated, but then in some ways they water down the traditions. And I don't think it's people's fault. I think it's the quality of the information that's available, because a lot of it's now online. A lot of people aren't even reading books. They're reading, small snippets of things, or like 30-second videos, and that's not enough to teach you really anything about anything. And I said, this one particular day, I said, I just feel like people are putting a lot of shackles on themselves, and they're really keeping themselves restrained. And then as we got into that, I think the metaphor popped up at some point in the conversation. I don't know if I said it or somebody else said it, but they sort of echoed it back to me if it was somebody else, but said chains, and it pinged something in my head. And I thought it is. I thought it's like almost like a chained animal witchcraft has become, and it's so cruel because I say in the introduction it should be wild and free, and I was almost seeing it like this really sad, like advert, like we have the things on TV like donate £2 a month and help whatever, and I thought someone almost needs to do that for witchcraft. And I was going to do some posts online, and I don't remember what I actually started with, but I started just outlining something because I thought, let me just see if I've got anything worth saying to even make this post. And I started typing, and I just had more and more thoughts. And then I thought, is this going to be book two? And I thought, yeah, maybe, yeah, sure. I'll just take everything that I've been a little bit annoyed about, and I'll see if I can try and contribute, because there's no point being annoyed about it when there's no information there. So I thought, well, I can surely provide some information. If people want to read it, they'll read it. If they don't, they don't. But I can at least say I tried. I tried to contribute in a way that would help. And it's been very well received, which I was kind of shocked at. I actually thought, because of a lot of the aversion to history things today, people got, it's a bit too historical, it's a bit too, and as you said as well before, like, does it meet these check boxes? Like, do I meet the check boxes? Because my first book, it was a translation and a commentary. This was my first book where it was solo me. I was outlining the template, I was deciding what the full content and what each chapter was going to be called, and it was kind of a scary thing to be that exposed. I was quite honest in the book. I was opening up a bit more about myself and my background, and it was kind of scary. I remember when it was ready for going live, I wasn't bothered until then, and then I thought, I think somebody sent it me, and they said it had arrived in the post, and I went, oh no, and I was sat at home, and I was asked what, and I went, people are going to read my book, and they went, is that not the point? And I was like, yeah, but it's frightening.
Oh no, I can certainly yeah, associate with that. I've written a few, and each time it's just like, oh my God. And then yeah, you get positive reviews, and you get the first negative review, and it's just like, and it breaks your heart. But it's just like, well, it's out there, and what's and all, that's it. But talking about books, and I'm mindful that we are actually running out of time, which is really unfortunate, because I've so much more I would want to sort of chat to you about. Your first book is Aradia, and I do understand that you are sort of working on expanding this. So what brought you to write your own commentary? Because I do have a few collections of Aradia, a little pamphlet version that I picked up back in the day when I was in England, and also one of the standard interpretations of it. But yours is even different, though, apart from the original text that most of us are familiar with, you've brought up some really interesting points that tend to be missed in modern day interpretations or understandings of it. And now you're putting out a follow-up or an expanded version. So obviously you have a lot of insight as to what people are missing in this story.
Yeah, this was one that I came across originally in high school. I think this is one that I got out of the school library. It was quite fortunate. They had a good little. It was just like one shelf, but it was a good shelf. And I borrowed all the books constantly. Never went in the library for anything to do with homework. It was just to read that one shelf and get out. I think you could take out 3 books at a time, so it was just working from one side of the shelf to the other. And I remember thinking it was there's parts of the story that they're kind of difficult to grasp. And I circle back to it a lot. And I thought, yeah, it wasn't just my age. These stories are a little difficult in places. And I don't know what it was, but one day I thought I've just done, because my internal monologue is just English. It just chappers on in English. And this particular day, I think I just happened to notice one of the lines, and then I thought, that's not quite what it says. The original Italian passages, and I thought, that's not actually quite what it says. And I thought, I've never actually read those bits, because the rest of it being in English, I just skipped over those bits and just carried on, just let myself just stay in one language. And then I sort of had a deep dive, and I just ended up collecting notes. And then I noticed a lot of people were releasing the book, and I wanted somebody to do this book. And a lot of them are just reprints with forewords, which is great in one respect, because it keeps the book out there, and keeps people aware of what I think is quite an important text in the history of the craft. But I was kind of disappointed no one had ever bit the bullet to look at it a bit more. And I just made this throwaway comment to my mum, and she just said, she was in the kitchen. We were in the kitchen talking, and I'd seen it on my phone, and I was looking at this new edition, and I was like, oh, it's just a thought. Oh, I disappoint. And she said, oh, you always say this when a new one comes in. And she went, why don't you just write it yourself? She said, you've got all these notes tucked away somewhere. I'm sure people will want to read it. And I was like, no, who's going to read my book, you know? And then she just went, well, just go write it then. You know, just write it. That's all you have to do. Even if it doesn't go anywhere else, just write it out. So I did that. And then when I was finished, I was kind of pleased with it. So I then just thought, right, I'm just going to try it. I'll just send it off to one place, which was Llewellyn. And I just said, if it doesn't go anywhere, I'll turn the Word document into a PDF and I'll dump it on Facebook. And whoever wants to read it can read it. And very quickly they got back and they wanted to sign a contract, which then I showed everybody and made sure I was reading it correctly and I wasn't having a dyslexic moment, you know. um, and yeah, it went from there. There were a few things that went into, we'll say, the cutting room floor during the editing process. But I'm now re-releasing it with Crosscrow Books. So the expansions, almost those bits, the bits that I sort of wanted in there originally, it's already done, but it needs to go through editing, which I think is scheduled for next month. I get the first round of just looking it over. Not much needs doing because obviously it's already gone through the editing process once. So it's just the expanded bits, which is the part 2 part of the book, because my commentary is not changed. Just the additional little section I had at the back on how you could take the gospel and inspire it for practice. I wanted to expand that because there were things I've missed, like the prayer to remove the evil eye. You know, Malocchio is so important in Italian culture. And I was like, I have a really cool practice that's in my family, and I thought, why did I not include that in the book? You know, so those few little things have been added to expand it. I'm looking forward to people getting hold of that for that reason.
No, thank you. So it's something we can look forward to later in the year. Fantastic. And congratulations on the expanded edition when it comes out. We are unfortunately running out of time. So just want to sort of wrap it up. Where can people find you? I know I mentioned you're on Instagram. Where else can, if people want to get in touch with you, where else can they track you down?
So people can find me on Instagram at Witchcraft Unchained, which I named because I wanted to secure that title for my book. I knew it would be compelling to a publisher. You can find me on Facebook, Craig Spencer. You can find me on Twitter, which is now X, at Craig Spencer 90 with a capital C and a capital S. And you can find me on Threads, Witchcraft Unchained. I will say I'm on Twitter as a protest. I will be a voice of reason on that toxic platform and just sharing good things. So yeah, if people want to follow me there, by all means do, or anywhere else. And if anyone wants to ask any questions, feel free to send me a direct message and I get back as soon as I can.
Wonderful. And I'll put the links below this recording.
Thank you.
So, Craig, it's been absolutely delight talking with you, and thank you for sharing the magic in you.